Welcome back. Just a quick reminder that I have a few slots available for chess lessons. You can find out more on chessopenings.com/lessons. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a game in which I'm handling the white pieces and in which a King's Indian opening takes place. In the process, we'll learn a bit about the King's Indian, and we'll also get familiar with some Blitz tactics, how to handle Blitz games in an appropriate fashion. Let's take a look. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a Blitz game which I played on the Internet Chess Club against a player under the handle Westphalia. And in this game, I was rated about 60, maybe 50 rating points higher than my opponent, so I had a little bit of an edge on the rating, but enough that black should have a reasonable playing chances. So playing the white pieces, I began with the move pawn to d4, knight f6 was played, pawn to c4, pawn to g6, and now this is a little bit different from some other games which we've looked at, which begin with pawn to e6, where black is intending to bring the bishop to b4 in reply to the move knight to c3. But here, black is going for a different setup with his dark squared bishop, which allows white to achieve the move pawn to e4. And I'm under the persuasion that this position offers white quite good chances for the initiative, and I've covered some of the lines which can come out of these positions in a couple different apps for the King's Indian defense available on Android and on iPhone. So black replies pawn to d6, knight to f3 is played, castle's kingside, bishop to e2, knight b to d7. And this is a little bit unusual compared to the move pawn to e5, castles, and then knight to c6. And the idea of this setup is that white is provoked to play the move pawn to d5, the knight comes to e7, and now eventually black hopes to play the move f7 to f5, and this knight on e7 can be helpful both in defending this f5 point and also playing for a kingside attack by swiveling to g6 and then maybe to f4 or h4 later on for the attack. But in this game, my opponent plays a little bit more solidly, perhaps with knight bd7, but also somewhat more passive. So castle's kingside, pawn to e5, and now in this particular setup, again, a classical main line in the King's Indian, but not one of the best for black. White's strongest move is probably bishop to e3, where this bishop eventually helps to control the c5 square, perhaps allowing d5 and then c5. But in this game, I went for a quieter setup with the move rook to e1, and I think black's chances to equalize are somewhat fair in this position. White is simply just going to reshuffle his minor pieces, and he avoids putting the bishop out on e3, where black might be able to chase it around with knight to g4, even though, again, this position is known to be pretty decent for white in terms of getting an advantage. However, I simply played the move rook to e1. My opponent played pawn to c6. Bishop to f1 was played. Pawn to a5. This is no doubt anticipating the possible move pawn to b4. Black goes ahead and eliminates this possibility right away, and by doing so, he also tends to secure the c5 square, which may come in handy for the knight on d7 after this pawn on d4 is removed. For example, black may exchange the pawn on d4 when it's his turn to do so, and then move the knight to c5, putting pressure on e4, and then this pawn on a5 comes in handy because white cannot play the move b2 to b4. Or alternatively, white may at some point play the move pawn to d5, and then again the move knight to c5 ends up being handy. So pawn to a5 is a typical move in this kind of position and pretty reasonable. Now again, it's a blitz game, and I'm not going to try to do anything too major. I just play rook to b1, perhaps setting up a3 and b4 at a later time, or maybe just getting the rook off of the diagonal so I can play b3 and bishop b2 without having to worry about any kind of tactics along the long diagonal. So I play rook b1, he captures, I capture. This is a little plus for white that he now has the knight on d4 centralized, and the pawn on d6 is now exposed on an open file. So white has some imbalances that he can work with in this position. Rook to e8 is played, bishop to f4, immediately targeting the pawn on d6, and now knight to e5. Now, I rather like these kinds of positions because I've played a bunch of blitz games in these positions against a local international master, Ignacio Perez. I've played many, many games with this kind of structure for white, and in my estimation here, white's main point is that he needs to make sure that black doesn't get any active play. If white can keep black restrained just enough, over time I can use the extra space granted behind these pawns to maneuver my pieces and eventually gain an attack on d6. And I can play a waiting game for a long time. I don't have to really make any progress for a long time to come. All I need to do is make sure that black doesn't get any serious play. However, I did continue a little carelessly here. I continued with the move pawn to b3, just, again, marking time. But very quickly, my opponent found a strong reply. He played knight to h5, an excellent move, because if my bishop comes to e3, which is what I did, he can now attack this point with knight to g4. And he's starting to get some real play here, opening up the bishop and kicking this bishop around. This is what happened. Perhaps bishop d2 would be stronger, but now perhaps queen to h4, and either one of these pieces can come to g4. So this is kind of the appeal of this kind of variation of the King's Indian for black, that white hasn't done a whole lot wrong. It's not even particularly clear how I should have improved upon the move pawn to b3, but right away, black was able to start getting some substantial piece play, and already I was starting to feel a little bit shaky, and I need to give up the bishop pair in this position. So not panicking, I decided to go for some imbalances in this position. I played bishop to e2, allowing him to capture the dark squared bishop, which is, of course, the worst bishop, the bishop that white doesn't want to get rid of because it's on the opposite color of the central pawns, meaning that the dark squared bishop was probably the one I wanted to hang on. But as I sometimes share with some of my private students, I do enjoy playing inferior positions. And this is something that the former world champion Emmanuel Lasker was also good at doing. There are some psychological advantages to having a worse position. As white, I'm definitely going to be fighting really, really hard, and with excellent poise, I'm going to be trying really hard to make the best of what I have. And black may have a tendency to get a little bit overboard. And if he makes one mistake and starts to fall behind, oftentimes it's harder to recover from mistakes when you come out of a winning position than it is when you come out of a worse position. So, and there are always some imbalances. I do have the open F file. Even though these pawns are not so great, pretty crappy, it still turns out that these pawns may be beneficial for some kind of end. For example, right now they're holding the d4 knight, and I'm holding on to the d5 square. So there are some reasons to suspect that I have some chances of still getting some play here. Knight to f6 was played, bishop to f3, knight to d7. I really like this move. Black's doing an excellent job of maneuvering with his knights. I mean, this whole game, maybe for the last several moves, he's done nothing but move knights around, but in the meantime, he's managed to damage the pawn structure, gain a bishop pair, and now this knight is sinking in to the e5 square, which is absolutely indicated by the pawn structure here, because there's no d-pawn, no f-pawn, so nothing can challenge this knight on e5. So I now continue queen to d2, knight to e5 was played, rook b to d1. I want to take a look at this pawn on d6. Black played queen to h4, and now queen to f2, just offering an endgame. Black accepts the challenge, king takes f2. So again, I'm counting on the d6 pawn and hopefully any mistakes my opponent might make. He plays h5, no doubt securing the g4 square for a piece to come in. I play h3, and now another excellent move by my opponent, who's just playing excellently to begin with. He plays pawn to a4, totally unexpected, and I immediately capture the pawn, only to be met with knight takes c4. A very, very interesting maneuver, but of course I don't want to capture on c4, allowing him to capture on a4, when now both the a2 and c4 pawns would come under attack. And therefore, after knight takes c4, I continue with the move rook e2, defending this pawn and perhaps coming to c2 with the rook. And now my opponent continued with his first major mistake of the game, because up until now, black has been doing very well. But as I'm fond of saying again and again, Kasparov said, chess is won by the player who makes the second to last mistake. So I've made at least one major mistake in this game, but now it's black's turn to finally make the next mistake. He makes the move pawn to b5. This, in fact, could have been met in a number of strong ways by me, which would have allowed the game to become unclear. But this move needed to be prepared first. After some look, it appears that black should have started by defending the b6 square with his bishop, perhaps moving the bishop to f6 and a d8 so that he's holding on to this square here, and then perhaps finding some way to defend c6 before he plays the b5 pawn. I know I'm explaining that fairly quickly, but basically what I want to say here is that the move b5 is just a little bit premature, and the best reply is for white to instantly capture the pawn on c6, so that now, after the move b takes a4, I can reply with b takes c4. At the present moment, I'm up a pawn, and there's a pawn weakness on d6, and the position is very unstable, but it's also quite unclear, and at this point, I'm starting to get some compensation for my weakened pawns and for the lack of the bishop pair. Instead, the computer recommends that black reply with knight takes e3, getting rid of his knight in this strange fashion. King takes e3, b takes a4, and now pawn to b4. And at the moment, the material would be equal, but I have pressure against d6, a potential passer, or actually this pawn is automatically passed on b4, and the position is unclear. The king's centralization could turn out to benefit white, or it could turn out to be bad if the king comes under substantial attack. But this would be the way that I could have played here. Instead, I immediately snacked on the knight on c4. Black replied with rook takes a4. I captured on b5. He captured on b5. And now both sides again make a series of terrible mistakes. I continued with the move pawn to e5. This is just designed to get this bishop in here. I'm actually playing in desperation mode because I feel that being down the bishop pair and having these weaknesses is just too much to bear. But I continue with pawn takes pawn, black plays, my opponent. I played bishop to c6, complicating the position. And now my opponent misses a substantial opportunity. He can simply play rook d8, pinning the knight to the d1 rook, and at the same time attacking the knight. And now, even if I take the pawn on b5, he can retreat the rook, and finally I don't have anything I can do about the knight on d4, and therefore I would be losing a piece. And this is why my maneuver of pawn to e5, followed by bishop to c6, is simply no good. However, my opponent finally makes another mistake. He simply captures the knight. Again, this is a blitz game, so it's somewhat understandable. And now white suddenly has a slight advantage because I've just taken the rook on e8. I now am up the exchange in exchange for a pawn. So he captures on e3. I capture king takes e3. He gives me a check. I play rook d3. He gives me another check. I play king d4. And here I thought I would take a draw if he just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I thought that I would take a draw in this position. But in fact, the bishop's on h6. I played king to d4. Instead, he plays rook a4 check. And my king comes running up the board with king to c5. Now another strange move, rook to c4 check, and I take the pawn. All of a sudden, black is doing things which I simply don't understand. He's just given me now a winning position because I'm up a full exchange. My king is well placed, my pawn on a4 is well placed, but it's not over yet as both sides continue to make substantial mistakes. Rook to c1 was played. I played rook d8, getting very excited about the chances of attacking this bishop. Instead, the move bishop to d7 would be a simpler way of simplifying the position. I'm showing a potential line here.
And now, for example, this bishop has no really good squares to go to. If he goes to c8, he'll be picked up immediately by rook d8 check. So black actually needs to play king g7. I play a4, so that now I'm threatening to take. He has to play bishop c8. My pawn comes to a5. This pawn is running through. However, I played the move rook to d8, not the best move. He plays king to g7. And again, sometimes the hardest thing to do is win a one position. And all of a sudden, I'm beginning to play in a way which is not so logical. He plays bishop e6. I play a4. And now I simply allowed him to play bishop g5, skewering the rooks. I play rook d7. He played bishop c4 check. I played king to b4. Pardon me, I used the other rook, rook d7. Bishop c4 check. King to b4, check. Takes. So now the material is completely equal. He played king to f8, hitting both of these. I played rook to c7. He took. I took. And now the position is probably slightly better for white because I still have a pass pawn over here. But definitely not great play by either side here. Rook b1 check, king to c5, rook to a1, rook to b4, getting ready to bring the king to b5 without the fear of a check. My opponent now played the move king to e7, king to b6, f5, a5, g5, a6, king f6, king to b7, f4, so clearly black is trying to hurry as quickly as he can to create a pass pawn. a7, king f5, queen is made, black captures, the king captures, pawn to g4 is played, h takes g4 is played, h takes g4, the king is running back, trying to prevent black from making me sack the rook. He plays f3, and now I miss another big opportunity. If I simply play the move pawn to g3 and bring the rook to f4, there will be no question that I'm winning the game here. But time is ticking, and instead of this, I capture the pawn, and he captures. And I play rook b2, also a mistake. King to e4 is played, king to c6, king to e3, and now the players continue going wild. I play king d5, f2. I really want to try to flag him with rook b2 check, but I'm actually down on time. King f4 is played, rook b1, king e3. Again, white is the one down on time, so this is very exciting, but of course I have a clear draw if I need it. King e2, king e4, f1 becomes a queen, and now in fact I play rook b2 check, king d1, rook b1 check. I'm down on time, but my opponent actually plays king to c2, which after rook takes f1 leaves me in a fantastic position, because even though I'm down on time, now if I flag, I actually only have a draw. So this is an absurd strategy by my opponent, because now I have absolutely no winning chances. There's no way, there's no theoretical possibility of me losing the game, even if I manage to flag. I'm still down on time, but after a small skirmish, king c3, rook f3 check, king c4, pardon me, king c4, rook e3, king c5, rook d3, king c4, rook d4 check, king c5. This goes on for another 15 moves, but in fact I ended up winning the game on time, as black simply just could not figure out where to place his king.
Before you go, if you have an opportunity, be sure to check out that we have 3 applications available on the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Check them out.